Although I managed to reach the United States through the Darién jungle, I had to spend months in therapy to be able to overcome, or at least try to cope with, everything I experienced. My traumas surfaced quickly, and I found it difficult to relate to other people, even my boss or my siblings. That was definitely hell, and I could relate to what people said, that if God existed, he abandoned everyone who entered that jungle. We were halfway through in the deepest part of the jungle. The group was fairly large, around 50 of us. I heard many stories of people who had it as bad as I did in their home countries. Others lived in far worse conditions. I didn't even feel like complaining when I heard so many horrible experiences. Some of us tried to keep our humanity intact, but others were really rude, impolite, and disrespectful. Even though our guide was kind and tried to maintain order, sometimes he lost his patience and would say that his job was to guide us, and it wasn't his problem if we decided to kill each other. It was true. This man endured a lot, putting up with people who complained and begged him to slow down or stop, even though they knew the dangers that lurked in that place. And when he refused, they insulted him. It was worse when the sun started to set. They told him it was time to stop and wait until the next day to continue the journey, but he didn't care. He wanted us to keep going as far as we could. Then came that night that changed everything, a night that left its mark on all of us who survived. We slept soundly, more from exhaustion than comfort. It was uncomfortable, and the mosquitoes didn't help at all. Plus, I realized that if we focused, we could hear screams from other parts of the jungle, but it was better to ignore them. We couldn't help those people. Suddenly, men armed with guns, knives, and machetes appeared and surrounded the entire group. Not even the guide knew what was happening. They herded us into the center like cattle and made us kneel. We waited there for several minutes while those who had more courage begged these men to release us, to let us go, and that if necessary, they would give them everything they had. Those were the ones who were beaten to shut them up and make it clear that begging wouldn't help at all. Finally, a boy arrived, escorted by 5 more men, and he walked among us, watching, observing, as if he were studying us. He wore jewelry around his neck and hands, but his clothes were torn and very dirty. He chose a woman from among us, and they separated her from the group, while another man carved a strange symbol into one of the trees using a knife. We all watched as they put the woman there, and then they took her life in such a bloody way that I'd rather not go into details. Her screams echoed through the jungle until there was silence. No one moved. No one did anything. We all watched without lifting a finger. Then the boy chose another person, and we understood that he could spend the whole night doing this without caring about our lives. We were all scared, but staying there and being killed one by one was pointless, so the men in the group stood up and attacked those who were holding us like cattle. Gunshots and cries of pain could be heard, from both our group and theirs. I ran and hid behind a tree, watching everything happening to good people who were just trying to defend themselves. That's when I felt someone grab my leg. It was one of those bad men, trying to drag me into the jungle to who knows where. My brother appeared at that moment and hit him over and over with a rock until he killed him. He froze at what he had done, but there wasn't time to think about it. The guide had escaped and signaled us from the other side to follow him with a small group of 10. We joined them and left that place, but we never saw the others again. We could still hear screams as we ran, but we couldn't look back. We abandoned them. I can't say that reaching the United States was worth it because many lives were lost along the way, and others were taken defending themselves from those horrible people. I ran from fear like a coward, and I have to live with that for the rest of my life. I want to tell the story of when I crossed into the United States through the Mexican desert. I was in a desperate situation, and that's what led me to make the decision to leave my home country. Unfortunately, I had no idea that this would lead to the traumatic experience of witnessing paranormal activity and behavior in the middle of the night. There we were, walking under the hottest sun I had ever felt in my life. The heat was just as exhausting as the sand that got into my shoes, making it feel like my body weighed even more. The attitude of the coyotes, as the people who guide you through the desert are known, didn't help much either. He kept saying that he wasn't going to help anyone who fell behind, because that would put the rest of the group at risk, and that was something he couldn't tolerate. He reminded us that we had all already paid him, and that he didn't care if someone fell, got lost, or even died. They were truly cruel, but I soon understood that you needed a strong stomach for situations like this, and in part, he was right. He kept an eye on everyone, even though we didn't like the way he acted. He made sure to count us every few hours to make sure no one was missing and told us when it was time to drink water, sit down to rest, or slow our pace. It was an incredibly exhausting journey, but in the end, it would be worth it. Everything changed when the night of a full moon came. I noticed a woman who kept asking how many more days it would take to get there, and one of the coyotes couldn't stand her anymore. He made up a number, telling her it would be about 10 or 15 days. She became nervous, saying they needed to arrive quickly because she had made certain promises to someone, although she didn't say who, and that she absolutely had to fulfill them soon, but everyone ignored her. When the next night came, I kept an eye on her. There had to be some reason why she was so anxious, and she certainly had one. I didn't sleep watching her the whole time, and then I saw her get up and stand there, watching everyone while they slept. She stood still, like a statue. Then I felt a very cold breeze on my face. It was strong, but the sand didn't rise. My skin prickled, and I felt a strange chill that made me crawl backward, moving even further away from that woman. That's when I saw her look at one of the men who was traveling with us, a man of about 50 years old who was sleeping peacefully and deeply. She approached him and grabbed him by the neck without hesitation. I wanted to scream, but I was so shocked by what I was seeing that I couldn't speak. I can't exactly describe what it was because I don't remember clearly, but I know it was an overwhelming sensation. I found it impossible to say a word, and none of the coyotes were awake when it happened. I tried to run toward them to pull her off him, but that woman pushed me with such incredible strength that I flew several meters backward, rolling in the sand until I tumbled down a small hill. The impact was so hard that it left me a bit dazed. It took me at least 1 or 2 minutes to stand up and climb back to the group. When I got there, I saw that the man was already dead. The woman had killed him. Suddenly, she let out a horrible scream at the top of her lungs, a scream so deep and loud that it seemed to tear her vocal cords. That woke the rest of the group. Chaos erupted when they saw the woman looking different. Her skin had turned a grayish color, with her veins showing in blue from her legs, arms, neck, and even on her face. Her eyes had turned a reddish yellow, like pus mixed with blood, and her lips were cracked as if she hadn't had any liquid for days. The leg pain she had been complaining about seemed to have disappeared. She was drooling excessively and glaring at us with hatred. One of the coyotes, who was further away from her and hadn't realized what had just happened, yelled at her to shut up, saying it wasn't the time for fights, and told her to go to sleep and let the others rest so they could regain their strength for the next walk. A young man around my age approached her and put a hand on her shoulder, telling her to calm down and trying to stop her screaming. We were all shocked when she slapped him so hard that he was left lying on the ground. Once again, her incredible strength was on full display. She began making strange noises while everyone backed away from her, and then she went after the closest person, a woman who said her son was waiting for her in the United States. She caught up to her and with her bare hands, dug her nails into her face, leaving such deep wounds that she immediately tore off pieces of skin soaked in blood. She left her there, screaming in pain, and then went after one of the coyotes, who was struggling to draw his gun, while I ran to the woman who was bleeding on the ground. The wounds on her eyes and neck were so deep that there was no way she was going to survive. It was impossible. The worst part was that she begged me not to leave her alone. But then I looked up and saw that demon-possessed woman staring at me with pure rage. She ran at me at full speed and I couldn't even flee because my legs wouldn't move out of the sheer terror I felt. There was no way I could escape from such a possessed soul. I closed my eyes and braced myself for the worst. That's when I heard gunshots. One of the coyotes had managed to pull out his weapon and put an end to that woman's life, if you could even call it that. We approached her body to confirm that she was really dead. 3 people died that night, in a way none of us could have imagined on that difficult journey in search of our dreams. We had to resume the walk immediately, leaving the bodies behind us, with the fear that something like this could happen again to one of those of us who survived. It didn't happen, and we made it to our destination safe and sound. I have no idea to whom or to what she made promises that she clearly couldn't keep, and she ended up possessed by something sinister. It was, without a doubt, a macabre experience, one that will stay with us for the rest of our lives. When I made the decision to emigrate to the United States, I prepared myself to face the dangers I had been warned about, but I never imagined I would encounter something supernatural and sinister. I experienced true terror, without mercy or compassion, and I abandoned the idea of migrating to another country forever. A friend had told me about the possibility of going to the United States by paying a large sum of money to some people who would smuggle us in the back of a cargo vehicle. They loaded it with baskets of fruit so we wouldn't be seen by those who checked, and we hid in the back. Anyway, when we were about to leave, they told us that the disguise was only to avoid suspicion, since the police knew about us, and would let us pass without trouble because the driver bribed them. That's how it went at each checkpoint we encountered, and everything was going smoothly. I was traveling with that friend, and he told me that things were really bad in the country he came from. He couldn't afford to feed his family anymore, and he had managed to get a bank loan to pay for this trip. I did the same, though my parents and siblings helped by contributing what they could, as what I had was not enough. I thought about the United States, wondering if it would be like the movies portrayed it. I was finally going to have dollars in my hands, but I couldn't stop worrying about the fact that I didn't speak English. There in the vehicle, a man told me not to worry about it, that he knew many people over there who could barely speak Spanish well enough. We laughed. At least we had a good atmosphere there. And that's when one of the women who had remained silent throughout the trip spoke. She said she had overheard the driver on the phone, saying that they were taking us to a completely different place. We all looked at each other, but we didn't just react to her words. We also noticed her behavior. She had been trembling for a while, and we all thought it was due to the cold. For a moment, I wanted to believe her, that she was really warning us. But then I remembered all the money we had invested in this. I refused to believe it was a scam because that would mean our ruin. Some suggested getting off at the next checkpoint, while others thought it would be better to throw the woman off the vehicle so she wouldn't cause trouble for us later. In the end, we did nothing, but they all looked at her with disgust and distrust. It wasn't her fault for telling us, but that's when she made the decision to jump from the vehicle as soon as she saw it slow down a bit due to some potholes on the road. We rushed to check if she survived, and fortunately she did. She stood up and signaled for us to jump too, but no one did. We put the tarp back over the vehicle and waited until we fell asleep. A few hours later, still at night, those transporting us woke us up. The vehicle had stopped, and they were calling to us from outside, saying it was time to get off because we were going to take a different route in another vehicle. When we got off, we found ourselves in front of a luxurious farm. Around us was nothing but wilderness, and just a few meters away were about 8 men with weapons in their hands, pointing directly at us. There were 10 of us, unarmed, with only provisions for the trip. They told us to walk forward, behind the large pool nearby. They led us in a line as if we were cattle. At that moment, we realized that the woman had been telling the truth, and we had made a terrible mistake by not listening to her. They took us to an area beside the luxurious farm, which really looked more like a mansion. We saw a large wooden cross buried in the ground, and on it, a man bleeding from multiple wounds all over his body. He didn't appear to be breathing, so it was clear he was dead. Beneath the cross were symbols drawn with his blood, and behind him came people dressed in black robes, 2 of them holding long knives in their hands. One of the men with us asked who they were and what they were going to do with us, but they didn't say a word. The fear I felt was unbelievable. Just seeing that man on the cross made me imagine that would be our fate. I didn't want to end up like that. My life couldn't end that way, and I refused to accept it. My friend with hand signals suggested we run into the wilderness. It was night, and it would be difficult for them to find us. This was our chance, the only one we would get. But the others saw our intentions and started running first, catching the armed men by surprise, and everyone ran into the wilderness in different directions. I took advantage of their distraction to join another group that started fleeing, and that's when a series of gunshots were fired at us, killing 3 of us. The others were shot in the legs to knock them down, and only 2 of us escaped into the wilderness. My friend was shot in the leg and fell into the underbrush, and in the chaos and darkness, I lost sight of him. I only had time to keep running, and I had to leave him behind, or they would have caught me too. I ran with a girl who managed to get deeper into the trees, and we didn't stop for at least an hour. When we finally did, we could barely catch our breath, and immediately continued walking until we reached a road. We asked for help, and they took us to the police, who sent us back to Mexico. There I called a relative who came to my aid, and I returned to my home country. I haven't left since. That traumatic experience stayed with me, and we couldn't even report what happened to the police because we didn't know where that farm was. I thank God every day for saving my life, and since then my faith in Him is all that accompanies me. Many people talk about the Darién jungle, but only those of us who have gone through it can say with absolute certainty that it is a hell far worse than the one described in the Bible. Fear never leaves your body. Sometimes you walk out of sheer inertia and the fear of being the last one, getting lost and being abandoned. Because I lived through that horrible experience, I write these words to tell you about my passage through that dreadful place. The situation in Venezuela was critical. Eating 3 meals a day was a thing of the past, and even 2 meals felt like a miracle. My family and I lost an incredible amount of weight, and the feeling of hunger became normalized. It was an exhausting situation. Everyone said they couldn't bear it another day, and then I received the proposal to go to the United States through the Darién jungle. I didn't hesitate and accepted with my family's consent. Right before we started the journey, some men told us it was like going on a hike, though much more exhausting and difficult, but that in the end, it would be worth it. I held on to those thoughts as long as I could, but it wasn't for very long. It was seriously exhausting. Sometimes my legs trembled with every step I took, and night was still far away. The mosquitoes were one of the worst tortures. That, and the stress of hearing the guide say we couldn't separate because he wasn't going back for anyone, warning those at the rear to pick up the pace and regroup with the others. I was shocked to see pregnant women, teenagers carrying babies in their arms, elderly men and women struggling just to walk for even an hour straight, climbing over every rock, hill, and mountain day after day. It was pure madness to realize that I wasn't the only one suffering in my country, but that people from many places were going through the same thing. The nights were the worst. On one hand, I wanted them to come so we could rest, but for long periods, you could hear the distant screams of some women, begging for someone to stop, to leave them alone, even to kill them, and much worse things I won't mention, things no woman should ever have to experience. I'm sure I wasn't the only one hearing it. Sometimes we could hear footsteps among the trees, which meant a wild animal was nearby, but eventually it would leave. As I said before, fear never left our bodies, not for a single moment. I could barely sleep, trying to do so before those distant screams began. Little by little, I started to notice people missing, mostly women. One woman told me she had seen some men come during the night and take a woman, covering her mouth with their hands, and 2 of them carried her away, and minutes later she heard her scream. I asked her why she hadn't said anything, and she answered that those men had guns and their eyes showed no hesitation in killing anyone. I understood it was the right decision. Maybe some of us wouldn't have been able to bear the sight of someone being taken from the group, and in a moment of adrenaline and impulse, more than one life could have been lost. The woman clearly understood what we were facing, and although it was hard to accept, There was nothing we could do but count on luck. The following days were probably the worst, or at least the most traumatic. We saw people lying on the side of the path we were following, stretched out on the ground, reaching out their hands, asking us for help, for water, for food, and begging us not to leave them there. Most were elderly, not fit for such a difficult trek, and they gave in to the exhaustion and pressure of crossing a jungle as dangerous as the Darién. Further ahead, all we saw were bodies lying along the trail, which we had to avoid as we covered our mouths to block the stench of decay. The guide told us to hurry because those bodies attracted scavengers, and if they saw us, we would become their prey. I saw the looks on the faces of the elderly people who thought they, too, would end up like that before reaching the end of the jungle. I figured that if even people in good physical condition found this to be torture, what could be expected for those who could barely walk? The worst day of all was when we encountered the threat of a wild animal. Some said it was a jaguar, a leopard, I don't know. I couldn't tell. Maybe a tiger. But the thing is, we heard something moving through the trees toward us. The guide kept telling us not to separate, but the sound of the leaves being shaken by who knows what terrified us, until it leapt from one of the tallest branches and landed on the back of the guy in front of me. I watched it devour him for a few seconds until fear and the will to live allowed me to circle around it and join the group ahead, which had already started running. All we could hear were screams as the animal attacked, choosing its victims by proximity. I only looked back once, and that was enough for me to run faster, not caring who was left behind. At least 30 people were lost due to that unfortunate incident, and more than 3 were killed, according to what the rest of us saw. It was impossible to go back for them. Many left the trail and ventured deeper into the jungle, hoping to escape the wild animal. I never heard from them again, whether they found another group, stayed on the right path, or were taken by the bad people who roamed the jungle at all hours. I made sure it was all worth it, and I managed to reach the United States. But every time someone asks me about that journey through the Darién jungle, I do everything I can to make them understand that it's a terrible idea, and that if I could go back in time even knowing that I made it, I would never go in there again.